Immigrants from China. What was a piece of media you didn't know was censored until you left China? Moved to the States at 6 years old. Learned about Tiananmen in the U.S. Visited Beijing with family at 13-ish. We visited Tiananmen Square. I asked my mom in public, "Hey, wasn't this where the Tiananmen Square massacre happened?" My mom got scared and told me never talk about this in public. Apparently there are undercover officers that walk around and would arrest us if they hear people talking about things like this. Didn't understand back then. I do now. When I was on a high school trip like 5 years ago, we had a tour guide. Such a nice and funny dude, who sat with a few of me and my friends while we were on our way back from a long day at a zoo or something. Everyone in the bus was half asleep, but we were chatting him up, intrigued by everything we were learning. At one point he mentioned the Tiananmen massacre, and talked about it with such sadness in his voice. He said he was a student while it was happening, and he protested along with the rest of his classmates. But then they heard sirens and gunshots, and then he said he just ran. He didn't stay there long enough to witness much. But on his way out of the square he said he saw one of his classmates get run over by a tank that was headed straight for the square. He asked us not mention anything about this story while we were still on that trip. It was so sad to see him afraid to speak about it. I've posted about this before. I literally had no idea about Tiananmen Square massacre until I got here. Most people older than me saw the protests in the streets, but I never heard anyone talking about it. Ever. My parents are from China, Uyghur, not Chinese. Mom told us that when the Korean Wars were happening, the CCP made her family donate their riches to help the cause in North Korea. It wasn't until they left China that they found out what a shithole North Korea was. There's not a lot here, so I'll write what I've experienced in China about Taiwan. At first they insisted it was entirely part of the PROC. Then when I asked about if they can go to visit, it was described as a place full of rebels with guns who'd shoot at them if they tried. This was in Fuzhou, which is only about 100 kilometers from Taiwan, and whose outlying town had a ferry to the country. So I was shocked they thought that, especially considering I just got back from taking that ferry and had the lovely time in Matsu. Passport control, sure, but no one shooting us or any of the ABCs. American-born Chinese that were doing a visa run. Chinese immigrant here. My family has political ties, so I heard more propaganda than usual. It's common for people to join the Communist Party to get ahead in life. Connections are pretty important. What surprised me the most was that people outside China seem to dislike China so much. Inside the country, the focus of our education was less about censorship but more about propaganda, aka China is best place ever. All 5,000 plus years of beautiful art and heroes, etc. That's why so many Chinese people will defend China so passionately and ignore any contradictory facts. No need for censorship because people were already non-receptive to any bad things said about their dear motherland. Anyway, that's why it's extra shocking to hear people hate on a place that felt like the best, even knowing all the facts now. Most Chinese people will only appear to be enlightened. To fit in equals not make trouble or cause people to judge them as you're secretly they remain loyal to China. It's like this. Imagine if you had a great childhood, subjectively, and your mom loved you and you loved her. Then imagine some strangers present concrete evidence that your mom is a terrible person and did terrible things. Can you hate her? Agree with the strangers? Just toss away all the good memories? While this doesn't completely fall under censorship, I didn't know about the Great Leap Forward until I was a young adult. Folks in my parents' and grandparents' generations would talk about the Cultural Revolution, but no one spoke of the Great Leap Forward. My personal theory is that it was such a disaster for government planning that everyone bought into There is a sense of loss of face, so no one wants to bring it up. Not sure what light it's painted in Chinese textbooks as I left the country as I was entering grade school. Edit. In the modern context and a much lighter note, many of my friends who grew up in China and never went abroad know nothing about the Western meme culture. They have their own self-contained meme ecosystem, which is actually quite strong, haha. Maybe this should have been tagged as serious. Obligatory not Chinese. But I lived in China for 3 years. I had Chinese HBO and was really happy to see many of my favorite movies come on when I was couch surfing. But half the time I'd watch them in, like, a day or two later I would be lying in bed trying to go to sleep and I'd remember a scene from that movie that didn't appear in the Chinese version. Apocalypto, much omitted. Ron Burgundy, much omitted. Thrones, much omitted. I wish I could remember which movie it was, but in one case an entire subplot was excised from the film this year. I got really angry about it. It pisses me off on an artistic level. I can't believe HBO and those who license their films to them let them compromise and devalue their art like that. Nice try, Chinese government. I live in India, but I study in the UK, so I have a lot of Chinese friends who I live with. What surprised me the most is how they talked about Tibet. They talk as if it's such a nice place to visit, a great tourist destination with people who love China. It just really shook me because I have been to Tibetan refugee markets. I have seen the squalor a lot of them live in. In India, I've seen so much Tibetan sadness that I couldn't make sense of how they could say that Tibet was the prettiest place in China. In my head, Tibet is not China. Tibet is a war-torn place with its people displaced. Edit. I should clarify. I love my Chinese friends. They're my best friends. And I have plans to visit China because it's a gorgeous country with very different values. I fully respect people's views and all. And it's a very hard topic for me to talk about because what I've been taught is also very different from what I see. And I tried my best to not become emotional as I wrote what I did above. So I apologize if what I wrote offends anyone. It's only what I've seen and felt that I've written. I've also taken out the one line I realized made my statement seem more biased than it actually is. Because it is in the end of what I've seen and heard. My wife, who is from China, came to the US in 2003. A Taiwanese classmate of hers asked her why the Chinese government could be so cruel during the Tiananmen Square protests. My wife argued with him and called him a liar until she found the videos of the protests on YouTube. I still make fun of her sometimes for this. I actually knew about a lot of stuff before I traveled to Australia. Since there was a period before 2008 when everything was accessible, like YouTube and Twitter and stuff. I remember I was crushed watching the Tiananmen Square Massacre documentary. It was an earth-shattering type thing, like finding out about a much uglier alternative reality that I actually live in. But I never knew if the organ harvesting thing is legit or not. And I never bothered to check simply because finding out doesn't change anything really. Every time I come back to China it's frustrating as hell, but you get used to it since there are Chinese equivalents of everything. Obligatory. I'm not a Chinese immigrant. Here's a fun little story, though. So about 4 days ago I was on a flight from LA to Singapore with a layover at Xiamen. Long-ass 9-hour layover. Problem number 1. Everything was in Chinese. Problem number 2. None of my phone's roaming was working. I tried buying a SIM card from the vending machine. Didn't work. I asked the attendant for the Wi-Fi machine. That was off and didn't work. The phone verification codes for the free Wi-Fi didn't work since I didn't have a Chinese number. I went to the SIM card store. And get this. They only sold Chinese numbers to Chinese citizens. When I tried pressing, they began making fun of me in Chinese. I think As a last resort, I went to the first-class lounge and asked them if they had working Wi-Fi. They said yes. Thank God. I paid the 250 yen. Got the password. Logged in. Fuck. Nothing works. Chrome didn't load any Google searches. Discord didn't open. Instagram didn't open. So I go to the attendant with my Google search and I'm like, "Excuse me miss, the Wi-Fi doesn't work." She sees the Google search and looks at me in horror. Not sure what the exact expression said. Maybe something like, "What the fuck? Don't do that." Quote. She said to me, "No Google here," and typed in Baidu.com on my phone. Loaded like a charm. That day I found out that you can't even use fucking Google in China. Well, obviously I can't live this life. So I go to the Play Store to download a VPN. Surprise. The Play Store doesn't fucking load. Luckily I had a secondary iPhone with a VPN already installed. So I used that to resume my Discord glory. Fuck China honestly. Taiwan, Tiananmen, Tibet. Not China, but one time I was on a flight. I think it was Qatar Airways or one of the other Middle Eastern ones. It was a long flight, so I settled down to watch it. Do you guys remember the scene where the Jewish kid is practicing for his bar mitzvah? Entirely cut from the film. Is there any mention of that kid's Jewishness? Cut. Half of the gory scenes in the movie? Cut. Really surreal experience. Not an immigrant but spent time in China. I was there in '08 when a massive 8+ mag earthquake rocked everything near Chengdu and was felt from Shanghai to Beijing. I was in a ship lock when it hit and our shit was rocking all over the place. It was wild. Over 80,000 people died. We couldn't get on the internet or make international phone calls for nearly 4 days. They jammed everything. None of my emails to my parents went through to tell them I was okay. All my friends' phones that were unlocked for international just went dead when you tried to call anything. The internet was basically cut off everywhere we went. We eventually found an American businessman at a bar with a sat phone that could get through, and he agreed to let us use the phone to call our loved ones as long as we got him a few drinks. He was chill as fuck. He was on the phone with his wife and then with his company when we approached him and begged to use his phone so we could call our people and let them know we were okay. China is an amazingly beautiful place, with great people, food, and culture, but their approach to censorship and speech is completely fucked. There is a running joke that when Chinese students study abroad, they complain, "Everyone else knows more about China than me." Not me personally, but my neighbor was from China. Her daughter was killed in a car accident caused by someone high up in the party. The incident got completely censored. I've posted about this before. I literally had no idea about Tiananmen Square massacre until I got here. Most people older than me saw the protests in the streets, but I never heard anyone talking about it. Ever.